How do you make sense of the world? It can seem impossible. History looks messy, chaotic. Wars cause suffering. Disasters overwhelm our ability to respond. Economic systems are fragile and imbalanced. Environmental dangers feel overwhelming. Injustice persists despite so much effort to make things better. What if we could make sense of it all? What if we could give you a lens to see how the world around you works? And what if, once you see how it works, you could make the world better, more prosperous? There is a way. It's a method as new as the latest tech from Silicon Valley, but also as old as the lessons from our ancient ancestors. It's learning to see the world as an ecosystem, and learning to see yourself as a designer of ecosystems. By seeing and designing ecosystems, you can understand how to shape the world and make it better. In this video, we'll take you on a journey with one sole purpose: to make you a designer of the ecosystem around you.
Let's try a thought experiment. Think of the world as made of many layers, like an onion. Imagine we could unwrap each layer of the world, and with each layer unwrapping, we could understand the world a little deeper. But these aren't physical layers. Instead, they're layers of ideas. We're going to take you on a journey to unwrap the world, one layer of ideas at a time. But before we unwrap the first layer, let's look at the surface to understand where we're starting. To do this, I'm calling on my friend, Ade Mabagunje, a researcher at Stanford. He's one of the world's leading investigators on how we design ecosystems. There's a part of human nature that likes simplicity and ease and efficiency and uniformity. Why is that?
Definitely, as an engineer, uniformity is easier to measure. Uniformity is easier to control. Uniformity just has all these properties. But I think the most important thing is that uniformity is easier to control. And so to optimize the system so that I think we do have a tendency, and that's part of our ego, towards control. We like control. To make it easier, since we are not exactly omnipotent, one of the ways by which we can control is uniformity. Just make all of them conform to our 7 plus or minus bits of memory. So it has meant that as we have expanded ways by which we can express our memory, symbolic memory, when it has expanded, when we went from just spoken word to written word, we could also increase the sphere of control. So when I go into small villages that are non-literate, there's more diversity of human beings. As we now found different ways of externalizing our memory, we were able to get military and soldiers, everybody to behave the same way. And we didn't actually need their variation. So we narrowed the variation, and that made it easier to control. So I think it's we wanted to control larger populations, but we just had small bits of memory to control a larger population. So you have to have a lot of uniformity. And that was very unfortunate for human population.
I think one of the challenges of a lot of cities as the frontier gets settled is people get settled. And so they see less possibilities by seeing the way people behave and act and do things in other places. I mean, if I could take 100 people and have them spend a week in a classroom such as this and be exposed to the methods of learning and the types of behavior that have been so successful, here for 50 years in this classroom, but in the Valley at large. And so I think the key is to pull people out of what they know and take them into places they don't know and expose them to just the limitlessness of what's out there.
If you ran a class to augment people's intuition, what would you do differently than it's been done now?
Really good question. One, we would teach people to do more improv, like we were doing, to be more spontaneous, to listen to themselves. 2, we would teach them how to take contrarian positions, to learn how to deal better with paradox, the pro-cons that we talk about, because the brain gets very stressed when we have to think or when we're given information that seems to contradict itself. We don't like to have to rationalize that. So there are ways to actually teach these kinds of skills. When you think about it, years ago, a lot of kids in school, particularly middle school and high school, used to take debate. And they would always ask people to take an opposite position from one they actually felt strongly about and have to defend that in some way. And I think we need to introduce more of those types of things into classrooms so that people can argue or at least take the opposite perspective, not because they necessarily believe it, but precisely because they don't believe it. And then that forces them to come up with perspectives and arguments that might support that.
Okay. And what do you then think we need to do in this transition from a physical rainforest to a digital one, in which it's almost like we don't have a choice, but we still have risk involved? What would be your suggestions and recommendations?
So finding ways of augmenting our intuition, something that will complement what we're already doing intuitively, but then create some more empirical foundation for that decision we're trying to make, so we feel better about it. Because ultimately, as much as we love to believe that human beings are these intellectual, rational things, what will often override that is our emotional, sentient nature. And when what we feel aligns with what we think, then we tend to feel good about the decisions. And so what we need to do are finding ways of, as we use these kind of more digital processes, analyzing a lot of this information and separating out the signal from the noise and giving people additional information, insights, perspectives that will then help them make smarter decisions, or at least make them feel better about the decisions that they are making. So historically, when we wanted to gather this information, we create a survey questionnaire and we go out and we ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, or which of the following 3 choices best reflects. Why is that a flawed process versus the anthropological approach that you guys take?
I used to work at a university, and I'm sure everybody who has worked at a university understands that at the end of the semester, your students are given this, little survey to talk about, how they found the course, how they found the instructor, right? So, and this is proven research. What they found is that faculty members who tend to score very highly on these studies tend to actually be less effective, because one of the things they found is that education, particularly university education, is meant to actually push the paradigms in students' minds. And that process of pushing the paradigm and change is highly uncomfortable for a lot of students. So the ones that are a little more controversial, that force them to think differently, to actually force them to work a bit harder for the grade, they tend to score lower. But in terms of what that means for the process, the actual, cognitive shift and expansion of the mind, that's highly positive. So that's actually a false type of relationship. So that's one reason, is that it doesn't really get at why this thing happened. So if we had gone in and asked, what was your experience in this class? What are some of the points where you really experienced something challenging that you overcame it, or something where, what about the class did you like or not like? You're actually getting at the context. And it's not just a number without the context. And another very clear point that I think everybody is cognizant of and highly aware of is people game or they gift. In the UK, for example, where we have implemented SenseMaker to actually complement some of the university assessment tools, what we found is traditionally the universities in the UK, their rankings are dependent on student satisfaction surveys. So how honest are students really going to be?
On the surface, the world isn't working as well as it used to. Growth is slowing across the industrialized world. Inequality is rising. And in the US, we're seeing higher rates of depression, suicide, opioid addiction. Life expectancy is actually decreasing. What's going on?
one of the things we have done, because we invented a very important thing, which is media, writing. So writing on a stone is actually non-organic. I mean, the stone is, but it changes very slowly. And gradually, we have shifted from organic media to inorganic media. And that began to take away a bit of our humanness. That in the plantation, we began to use these enclosures to begin to separate ourselves. And they are not human, but then we begin to give them priority. And we give our cars and gasoline priority. And so I can see that we're just about to start swinging back because we've upset the chemical balance. And so the more we begin to understand that, okay, it's all this whole ecosystem and the rainforest helps us to recapture our imagination. And once you look at it chemically, the number of possibilities re-expands. But if we narrow it down and think, okay, it's what we've now written, and then it's digital, and then it's money and capital, we basically get to what some people have called a singularity. But it's a singularity because we designed it to be that way. If we re-expand in the possibilities, chemistry is not a singularity. It's possibilities.
We're ready to unwrap the first layer of the world, fashion. This is the layer that moves the fastest. It's where trends happen, like news stories of the day, the local gossip, what someone is thinking or doing at any given time. So we were just talking about fashion, and fashion is, you said it's almost like the air you breathe, or it's like water. Explain that.
Well, I was making the point about fashion with respect to the clock of the long now, that there's fashion at the end, and there's also fashion at the interface between nature and culture. And so we have experiences in both. But over time, we've built up in which fashion is where most people live in. And their experience is that they just breathe in it. It's just normal. It's when you cross in between across cultures, and if you're paying attention, that you'll see the difference. And so that notion that the experience is all caught up in fashion, and that's what it makes us comfortable, but there are a lot of layers that hold it up. And it takes really being able to be at the frontier to see that, oh, it's not all yet built up. The frontier is where culture and humans were meeting nature, and then we build it up and build up all the layers. And if you pay enough attention, then you'll see that in engineering we call it the boundary layer between culture and nature. And it's an experience that we'll also see with children, because when they are born into the world, they are also at the boundary of nature and culture. And so just observing them that, they don't have those boundaries that we've built up.
So you say the shock. Most people need to get shocked to be able to see what's actually around them. How does one create that shock?
So the way you know that you're innovating is that you're surprised. All the things you had planned, okay, you could foresee that and you make the plan. But, and I think some people will use the word serendipity. I use the word surprise, which kind of, I think by using the word surprise, I am speaking to the emotion you express, you feel, when serendipity occurs. So the serendipity is an event. Okay, the surprise is what you go through, that you had this expectation, and then things happen very different, which forces us to question what just happened. But for some people, the response is fear. Something unusual has happened. So I would say that, yes, we have those different responses to novelty, because that's what the surprise is. It's always interesting to see when newborn babies are surprised. Okay, they don't know whether to cry or to be happy.
But it's possible to increase the probabilities of being surprised, right? Can you shape an environment where you're more likely to be surprised or someone's more likely to encounter serendipity?
So we can create a natural rainforest in which everything is not planned out, everything is not known. I guess the closest we would have to creating surprises will be the Easter egg hunt. Many moments of surprise.
You mentioned hunting. What's the difference between hunting and something else?
We were both the hunters and we were hunted. So you had to be vigilant, and we were looking for prey, but we were also prey. And so you paid attention to your environment, you paid attention to a lot of things. You had to use all your senses. One of the things I like to say about hunting is, for example, people who are long-sighted, people who are short-sighted, those are just natural phenomena. Because we had to look at things, the hunter-gatherer, the gatherers need to know things at a short distance. The ones who need to see far. So as a community, all the different ailments we had, all had a purpose. But the minute we became farmers, okay, I need everybody to see, then we had classrooms, there was a fixed blackboard. It tended to make us we started to desire uniformity. With uniformity, we will never have survived the rainforest. Okay, Industrial Revolution made us all uniform. So I'll say hunting requires the whole breadth of variety of human diversity. The other thing is that we have to be quiet to hunt the prey. So there's a time to be quiet, there's a time to be noisy. But when we're hunting the prey, we have to be quiet. Now, where the environment is noisy all the time, so we don't really have time to develop any of our inner capacities.
There's a lot of media talk about trends. So if you're following a trend, you're being utilitarian, and you'll just make the next step on that path. And our breakthrough innovation metaphor demands that you get off the familiar path. So we quite actually mean geometric abduction at 90 degrees. So it has nothing to do with where you came from or where you think you're going. And now you start experimenting again. You ask questions, you build prototypes, you test things. In our curriculum, you do that for 2 weeks, and then we demand that you abduct again. And through a series of abductions, you might find your way to an opportunity that nobody imagined at day one, and you discovered it because you wandered.
Moving on to the next layer of our world, each layer above depends on each layer below. Business. This layer is the stuff of commerce. People trading, transacting, selling, buying, sharing. You seem to think about businesses as processes or dynamics, things in motion. Can you describe how should we think about a business maybe that's different than what people normally think of as a business?
Well, one of the very definitions of business, or the idea of a business that I have found very, very useful, was that proposed by Peter Drucker. He observed that of all the different institutions in a society, business is the only one we're allowed to fail. That the rest of the institutions are designed to almost keep the order. So if our judicial system broke down, that would be catastrophic. If our medical system broke down, that would be catastrophic. If our schooling system broke down, that would be catastrophic. And so that puts us in a uniformity and a rigid world. Now we have this idea of business, which we allow to fail, okay? Which means it allows us to explore. So having business explore has been very, very critical to the evolution of the human race. I was very disappointed when we built out the banks, because the very basis of capitalism, of the banking system, was if you're taking the risk, then you have to be allowed to fail. And for the first time, we had a system that said, oh, you're too big to fail. We didn't say, the earth didn't say the dinosaurs were too big to fail. But somehow we perverted the system. And so I want to be clear that for businesses, if we go back to its original definition and how we define them, they're very critical to our evolution, but we also have to allow them to fail, because that's how we are testing new ideas. Being able to learn from businesses that fail, in addition to those that do well. I think one of the things I find a bit at fault in a lot of the business literature is they tell us about the success stories. I think the failure stories are also equally important because that's the mechanism by which society is learning, and that's very important.
Should we be doing more to encourage businesses as units of exploration and learning?
Yes, I would say that. I think some of my early work was on how can we increase the sustainability and reliability of new businesses. So a business for me is like a probe. And so if we can make those probes better and they can benefit society better, our evolution, our exploration will be much improved.
So you talk about businesses as probes. So how does that relate to this classroom here, ME310, which is a 50-year-old program here at Stanford? What is this program and how does that relate to what you're talking about?
I happen to have been a student in this class, and I had worked in industry for about 5 years. I used to be a drilling engineer, so I was in the oil industry. And I came to this class, and it's a class where we're given industry-sponsored projects, and we're given $20,000 as a team to explore a particular area. And in going through the class, I realized, the way the class is structured, I could as well have been working in my former company without the politics or the overhead. So I was now a free probe. You could call that other one a forced probe, to probe them. So I was now a free probe. In this class, I was not constrained. So I found that, okay, this is interesting. We could actually probe and explore new horizons that way. So a class like this, now coupled with more of the business sense, can actually probe and find out new horizons because the risk and the time investment are affordable. So the idea that the whole idea of that entrepreneurship and that spirit of probing could be brought down to, say, 18 to 22 years old people who had, they have their first degree, so this was a master's program, was just amazing. That and when I compare that to working in the company, I realized in the company I had the same energy, but I had all the restrictions of the company. And of course, the company was a bigger company, so I don't think it was ready to probe.
So how is value created in business?
In my work with innovation, all the value is in the human. Your talent development is value proposition. And we bring the talent to your company, and they can now further their value on issues of relevance to your company. But in terms of the education phase, we actually have to undo about 16, 18 years of formal education that told you to sit on that chair, get off the chair, throw it away, find something else. So this notion of abduction includes both your physical, intellectual, and emotional context.
This class stripped business and innovation down to its core, which was how people solve problems.
It took a while to invert that hierarchy. Now, I haven't gone to school always. It's the teacher that is in charge. Here, the teacher says, you know what? I don't know the answer. And you're kind of looking around, who's supposed to find the answer? I don't find anybody. And then you realize you're the one to find the answer. So by stripping away the hierarchy, which is what we had grown up in families in school, you begin to find that's how we used to explore.
So when you're working with teams, how do you design teams to be flexible enough to deal with all the ambiguity that they have to face?
We let people form teams through self-selection. A lot of people who are signing up to be part of a startup have some sense that it's not going to be a linear journey. Secondly is that people learn through failure. So there are a number of activities we do where we give them a taste of what it means to be in a world of ambiguity, what it means to be in a world where you don't know what to do next. And through these activities, they get a sense of, do they want to do this? Are they ready for it at this moment? And we have cases where some team members have said, okay, this is not for me. I realize this now. And they have left the startup team, they have left the company.
And you don't ask, what would you necessarily do? Is what advice would you give somebody else? Can you talk in terms of the psychology about why you do it in that particular way?
One of the things that we have found, and I think this is very pertinent to innovation as a field, is the value of ambiguity. What we've found, particularly in innovation, is that the concept of aesthetics, the way you make that acceptive leap from one idea to another is critical. And that doesn't come from that literal 0 to 10 thinking. It actually comes from you rapidly combining different facets of things and putting it together. And that's a uniquely human thing. The ability to actually create composite tools is uniquely human, because it's easy enough, for example, for like a monkey to take a stone and knock a coconut open, and there's water, right? They're tool users, but we're users of complex tools, right? We have the ability cognitively to say, I need to open this thing, but the stone is not enough because I need maybe more distance from it. So we actually have the ability to blend. I'm going to take the stick and this stone, I'm going to carve it into a certain way, tie it with some animal tissue together, and create an axe. And that ability to create a composite tool is uniquely human. And that can only come from ambiguity, understanding that this thing is not literal, but can be abstracted up a level.
We're moving on to the next layer of our world, the infrastructure. This is the layer with the infrastructure that undergirds our world. It moves a lot slower than the outer two layers. This layer includes our physical infrastructure, our buildings and our highways, but it also includes invisible infrastructure, like our digital networks, our social networks, our affiliations. I think of this classroom as infrastructure. I think of this university as infrastructure, but it's physical infrastructure. Are there other types of infrastructure?
When I define design, I like Herbert Simon's definition in his book, Science of the Artificial, in which he said, as human beings, we did not build the sun or the moon or the stars, but every other thing we have designed. We design culture, we design products, we design services, we design experiences. So all the things we've designed are really artificial. And so that's what I'll call the infrastructure as part of it. So laws are a form of infrastructure. But one of the very, very critical infrastructures that I find just fascinating is language. Language is the infrastructure we use to communicate one to another. It's an infrastructure, and it's supporting the communication, because otherwise, if I couldn't gesture, if I couldn't speak, I'll look at you, and if I couldn't move, I could be a tree. Okay, so language is an infrastructure. We invented it. And so one of the things that is, and that's a very key question, because what we're doing now in moving from the physical to the digital is that we have a new medium that we're reshaping. It looks like an infrastructure now. Soon it will become part of the culture because it's moving. So each of those layers will move with time. What was fashion today could become infrastructure tomorrow. Yeah.
I think you're saying that when infrastructure gets built, it becomes part of the air, and people don't even notice it's infrastructure anymore, yes. Like language. And you're saying the digital infrastructure is becoming something so normal and natural, we don't even think of it as unusual anymore.
That's it. It becomes part of the culture, the digital culture.
What does that mean for us if the digital infrastructure really becomes so ubiquitous we even stop noticing it, like water and air?
Yes, I think one of the things, it could mean that we could get lost. We could easily become consumed by our own infrastructure and no longer see. When you think of when we were hunters, we had to see, we had to perceive around us. Then once we became more like the more sedentary,
couch creatures,
we did not need to see. I mean, all I need to see, friend or foe. So when I look at a number of our old traditions, which would be like the meditation of the Buddhists, where they're trying to be quiet so that they can see. Because even language, that infrastructure was noisy. So my feeling is that as we build this infrastructure and as we inhabit them, it begins to dull our perceptions.
What is the map for innovation?
If somebody gives you one, you should tear it up immediately. That was dangerous. Because a roadmap to innovation can't possibly exist. And if it did, it would only be for incremental utilitarian innovation, not breakthrough innovation. And our curriculum is all about seeking breakthrough innovation. Part of the reason we seek that is that if a company comes to us with a challenge, our students are free to go anywhere, whereas your employee better do what's expected. And so they stick very close to the script, to what they perceive to be a roadmap or a trend. And again, I stress that our young students are free to go anywhere.
I'm very curious what your sense is of how you go about creating the right environment to support the community.
One of the things that I have found in my work is that communities, if given the right mix of tools, access, sometimes time, relationship, just support, they can create their own solutions that actually speak to the long-term sustainability of their own communities. And I would argue better than external parties could. We have spent several months educating the community through a unique asset mapping and capital mapping process, which allows them to see their communities through a different lens than perhaps they've been used to seeing, which has been helpful. And then after we do that together, so they really create their own data, after that, then we bring in our community leaders and our elected officials to have a different conversation with them. And they're regarded, I think, as experts in their region, and when they feel equipped with the actual resources that they need, I think it's a more productive conversation.
It's really nice to go in and say, I want 60% more productivity next year. But what does that mean? As opposed to going in and saying, we found that from your stories, you're saying, there are a lot of people who don't know people from other departments. So we're going to go in and say, oh, we found that also most of the interaction happens in the pantry. So how can we force more interactions in the pantry? One of our clients actually have found a really interesting way of doing that. Instead of actually having their regular coffee dispensers, this one company removed all their regular coffee makers and replaced it with Chemex coffee makers. Because you cannot brew a Chemex pot of coffee for just yourself. So the organization had this, it's like a fun little rule that if you're about to make a pot of coffee, make it a point to go and look for somebody whom you've never spoken to and share a pot of coffee with them.
Let's move on to the next layer of the world, governance. It's the layer that moves even slower. It's the systems that keep all the other layers outside ticking. It's a synergy of our laws, our rules, our institutions. Just like here at City Hall. They provide the guardrails for our lives. Knowing that our laws and our governmental systems are a form of infrastructure, how do governance systems play a role in ecosystems? For example, like a city hall. What is the role of a city hall or a state house or a White House in helping shape the society?
Understand that I'm looking at governance system really from mechanical engineering. So when I build a steam engine, the governor is what regulates and will open or close the valve. So the governance system prevents the whole engine from exploding. It will make the relief at the last time. So governance is very important. It is inhibitory.
Governance systems, they can work in two different ways, either top-down or bottom-up. Innovation comes bottom-up within a society, and a good governance system is one that's responsive to that cycle. as opposed to one that is authoritarian or dictatorial?
That is very, very key. Because innovation tends to take longer, in a lot of our current system, where we've all adopted a 4-year government change pattern, that has been very detrimental to innovation. I would say that, yes, even government, you could have entrepreneurial governance. So trying to create a system where we can begin to have even states change some of those rules so that we can experiment with governance itself. We are about ready for another disruption on how we govern ourselves. The dynamics have changed, and we have to not think of governance as a taboo area not to touch.
So what does good governance look like then in that view?
Having a purpose, being inclusive and open. And by being inclusive, being able to tolerate a different point of view. So when I mentioned that a lot of the drive of government to support STEM education, almost to the exclusion of the art, for me that's bad governance. It's just bad. Okay. And so once we begin to favor one and not the other, for me it's a red flag. When we exclude one, we become narrow and efficient and ready for extinction.
There's something about construction and real estate that has legacy about it. And when you think about the fact that most of our communities are built by Black and brown folks, even the buildings, I think that's a really powerful thing. I think it helps us to think about our communities in a different way. We're considering the neighborhoods as ecosystems. Any kind of information about the entrepreneurial ecosystem that helps to create a framework around how to create that, how to assess it, how to input capital or nourishment where it's needed, I think is helpful as it relates to how to rebuild our communities.
When people are at the edge, it's risky, they have to rely on each other, they have to form relationships and norms that actually enable them to survive. What is the role of the social contract in that?
What is the spirit by which we create the social contracts? Because sometimes when we create social contracts, people begin to hold them as cast in stone. And so for me, it's important that the social contract has the reason why we're making that contract. Here's the narrative, here's what happened, and because of this that happened, here's what we're doing, here's why we're making this contract. Because when the context changes, it's time to adjust the social contract. And so we have to teach even our children not just what the law is or what the contract is, but why. And by teaching them why, we give them the ability to shift.
Let's go to the next layer of the world, culture. This is about patterns of behavior. Culture is more than just the arts, it's how we do things, mostly unconsciously as a group of people. Just like here, at the original HP Garage, where Silicon Valley was born. It's the original garage startup where culture is everything. Do we value freedom or control, debate or consensus, chaos or predictability? Culture is what gives rise to governance and all the other layers on the outside. We were just over at the HP Garage. It's interesting how the HP Garage is this embodiment of what infrastructure and operational, organizational infrastructure is not nearly as important as what you start with from a cultural perspective. Can you describe the significance of the HP Garage in your perspective?
The HP Garage and the sort of culture it spawned, which was you can do great things with very little. We are each other's environment. This is it. We are each other's environment. So when we were hunter-gatherers, we didn't have garages, we didn't have the buildings, we had ourselves. And it was the forces between us that generated culture. Not you alone, not I alone, but together we created the energy which we called culture. And the HP Garage became really a good symbol of how small can nucleate a culture, that you can start culture, you can create the conditions for a new culture. And I think that's important because most people think of culture as fixed, that, oh, it's just a culture. Well, not quite. if you're starting a new business, I mean, if I try to start a business in, say, Manhattan, and I had to pay for this expensive, then most of my cost is going to infrastructure, the housing, and the rest. But if I can start my business in a garage, then all that cost, we don't have to spend that money. And so it was a very frugal existence, which was like the hunter-gatherer.
So value is not just financial, it's also physical and emotional, as you say. So what's the role of culture?
We have a somewhat contrarian view of culture. Most cultures are training you to cooperate. And our education program is helping you learn how to collaborate. Cooperate, do what's expected. Collaborate. We can agree to disagree, right? So being able to argue with each other and differ with each other is something that you actually have to learn now at age 20, because the last 20 years, starting with your parents, do what you're supposed to do. And this is so deeply embedded in child development and then in our formal school systems that when we're trying to prepare people to be breakthrough innovators, we have to unlearn everything.
You know, the work you're doing with narratives, collection of micro-narratives, sense-making is very fascinating. And I'm curious about your own journey and your own sense of sense-making.
What we've been doing in recent years is we've actually been building what we call a citizen engagement program. The grand vision is that we want students about 16 years of age all over the world to be journaling their experiences in their community through SenseMaker. And what that provides us with is actually this oblique way to understand how culture is shifting in communities. And beyond that as well is one of the biggest challenges I think in this day and age is people get all their news, they get all their interpretation through social media. You know, we want to be able to have these students share that data across all these students globally. Instead of saying and listening to the news to say, I'm so different than this person, they can say, oh, this person indexed their story very similar to mine, read the story and understand we're not that different.
So what does it mean to be human-centered?
I think it depends, once again, you know, what context that question is from. From the context of a designer, a product designer, to be human-centered means designing something for the users. You are part of the designing. As a designer, I cannot put myself beyond the product. You know, what are my biases, my desires? They need to be part of the designing itself. So human is not just the user. Human is you. Human is your team member. Human is the manager who is managing you, the customer who is going to buy it. So that's what it means to be human-centered from a designer viewpoint.
I want to test a pet theory with you. What does it mean to become settled?
Well, if you take the frontier thesis and you trace it all the way back, 100,000 years to the beginning of human civilization, the frontier has been moving ever since the plains of Africa up to the Middle East, out to Asia, out to Europe, and then eventually to the Americas, and then eventually to California. And as people get settled, you can see that happen. So if you spend time in Africa or the Middle East or Asia, you see what a settled society looks like, which is entire cities are people that are related to each other, and they know each other. And not only do they know each other back several generations, and they know who's related to who, and they know who did what 100 years ago to whoever else. And so those stories and those relationships get built up over time, like layers of stories, and it becomes very hard to shed them. If you go to a community like Kansas City today, you can already see a few generations of families get settled and people know each other. I think a big part of strong ecosystems is giving people the ability to mix and mingle and not get settled. And I think there's a set of the population that likes to mix. They like to explore. right? This is the diversity of the human species, where certain people like to settle, certain people like to explore. But if we make it hard to explore, then people will settle. It's easier in many ways to settle. So I think things we can do as society to make it easier is to make it more, to reduce the barriers for exploring, to give people the easier ability to go to school elsewhere, or to be able to move their homes to a different state or a different city, to be able to port their health care from one place to another, or their work licenses from one place to another. Right now, if you get licensed to do one type of job in one city or one state, many times it's very, very hard to move again. And I think those types of things actually inhibit long-term innovation and prosperity, because we're actually inhibiting the ability of people to explore and to seek out new possibilities. Now we get to the final layer, at the core of everything, nature. Beneath our culture, governance, infrastructure, business, and fashion is nature itself. That includes human nature too. Nature changes very slowly, like these redwood trees here in the Pacific rainforest. Without nature, no other layers above it can happen. Nature provides the basic code upon which all of civilization is built. It shapes culture, which in turn affects all the other layers. We were earlier out at the redwood forest. We know the rainforests are natural and farms are man-made. Not all natural things become very innovative or productive too. What is nature, and what are the aspects of human nature that are meaningful?
Human beings are very, very diverse. So the rainforest reminds us of just the variety of people we have. And it's almost like as we began to build a plantation, we began to have these idealized forms of what a human being would be like. The plantation has successive layers of enclosure. So the rainforest for me represents human in its diversity, human in its imaginative capacities. As we moved towards the farm and the plantation, we began to reduce that. Luckily, and this is what I think is very important, we didn't do it all at once. We could still have communities that are still hunter-gatherers. I fear for that process now. With the digital revolution, the cell phone and everything is reaching all wide, and we may just homogenize very, very fast. Then we'll have a bit of a hard time recovering our past.
How do we fight that? How do we continue to see what's possible despite the increasing homogeneity of culture?
The more digital we become, the more human we need to become. And so when I see a number of people go for retreats now and try to regain that experience of being human,
how do you retreat today? How do you take that time for solitude and that quiet time? And how do you do that as a woman?
It's another polarity, right? Alone and together. So many of us spend a lot of time in togetherness with our families, with our work. It's a different quality of engagement with ourselves. And that kind of engagement and self-care that is very solitary, but can be done with either one other or a group that are also engaged in that interior quest. That right kind of internal self-knowledge and self-care can really then nourish and fill up that empty battery of who am I? What is my voice? There's this notion of the cult of the individual. You have to be the best. You have to be on top. You have to be the most, your best self. And now yoga and meditation and mindfulness towards your best self. And there's this very masculine drive to make it. And yet when we really look at, the ancient teachings and the indigenous teachings around self-awareness, and then that same polarity starts to become activated in your own being. Who am I in relation to, not who am I in relation to my own success and magnificence? Who am I in relation to you, to all my relations?
We do have a few, what I'll call a few signals. So I'm very interested in mental illness. are they mad because that's nature, or they are mad as a response to the homogeneity we are creating? So that's part of a signal that we have to look at, that mental illness and a number of these things are signals that we may be getting something wrong. What we have defined as normal may not really be working for us again. Mental illness gives us a sense of the variety. We say they're abnormal. But that's because we have, each year we're defining normal too narrowly. So there are more abnormal people. In fact, I think we now have a lot of neurotic people. And then we've normalized neuroticism. It's no longer a mental illness.
So respecting our human nature is in many ways reopening what is normal again. Right?
Yes.
Reopening the possibilities, breaking down the enclosures that we've created in our heads.
You've got it right. That the enclosure worked, but now we can step back and say, well, they work, but what we're getting is not what we desire. And so we need to remove the enclosures again and reimagine. And that's very important.
So you talked about unlearning. So what is human nature then? Is innovation really about unleashing human nature?
Innovation is basic to human nature. And I think all of us were much better at innovation when we were in the hunter-gatherer stage of evolution. And since the Industrial Revolution, we're all doing what's expected, with our dear business schools being the experts at forcing us into what's expected.
The biological systems is related to the human body. We have all these different systems in the human body that serve a very different purpose. And the nervous system is the one we could say that carries the electronic signals, that carries the impulses. So that can be thought of as like a lot of the ideas that get put forth. So that's one place where these ideas can resonate, and they kind of go into the brain. We try to make sense of this stuff, and then we try to reconcile that with the rest of the body. But the other thing is, as we said, when we kind of convince the capital providers to put money into these ideas, that then releases the flow of the equivalent of blood in the system, the circulation. It's the thing that keeps the system pumping and moving forward. And so all of these systems kind of touch on the other thing, and then we need oxygen to breathe. But what's important about the oxygen is when we take oxygen in, it goes into our lung and then perfuses out through the system. But just like our blood, when it goes in, it doesn't just circulate round and around. It takes in oxygen, and then that oxygenated blood can go places that can then provide a value, and then it returns depleted of oxygen just so it can get more oxygen. So there's an actual give and take system in the body.
So how do you create that space to explore and the willingness to explore?
So there's this quality of, if I can inhabit that polarity or that conflict and be at ease with it in my own being, when I come into a room with people, let's say, who are in conflict about any issue, and I've already engaged that polarity inside myself, there's a certain trust that is just present. Right? So it's a more energetic thing. It's a more sense of, oh, she's not out to get me. Like, we read each other as animals. So there's a certain safety for those of us who are working with basically really intense populations that are very polarized, right? And we can even see that in our country right now. Somebody who's going to talk to a polarized, either individuals or groups, needs to have already some sense of integration of that polarity inside themselves. Now, it doesn't mean that we have the answers or the solutions or the notion of what to do from here, of how to come together, but we can at least be in the room together and not know, and start to talk in the way that I just said, where we get curious about, well, why are you, so in favor of X? What does that do for you? Or why are you so afraid of me? And as we kind of build that trust and that intimacy and that transparency, we start to notice the other side of that same polarity inside of ourselves. We're like, wow, that does make sense. Or, oh, I can really feel that. And then it's like, well, what do we do now? And then together we're in that innovative and creative process of like, well, it's a new moment, and maybe we could do it differently.
how does reflection play a role in that sharing of experiences?
So reflection plays a role in two ways. The first of all, it gives you a sense to squeeze the learnings from the experience that you just had. So you get a moment of silence to really think about what just happened. What are my thoughts? What's coming up? What are my feelings that are coming up? And you learn to write it down and share. So you get a sense of your own internal landscape. The second one, and that's the reason why we do reflection in teams, is you get to hear your team members who went through a similar experience of contrast. Because what they might go through could and is generally quite different from your own. So their lessons, their feelings, their thoughts. And together, the sharing of it actually leads to a much richer learning and a much greater understanding of this contrast.
One of the things we have been interested in is the role of women in innovation, particularly in large-scale innovation. What would you do to encourage more women participation?
I tend to think of it less as, we need to have women in particular, but more that we need more diversity of voices, of perspectives. For example, in Neeraj's work with teams, one of the things that we know is a good team comprises of people who complement each other. They might have very different skill sets, but they come together, and through that, the sum is actually much greater than its parts. And it's not just women, but women of different backgrounds, the ability to actually bring those perspectives in. So I think that there is participation. It's not that it isn't there. It's just we're not able to surface it. So one of the ways I've found useful is to actually provide voice to the everyman and understand how people are already taking part in innovation in ways that might not be formal. So what are the informal participation?
I'm here today at Harvard University. We're going to talk with Professor Edward Wilson. He's considered one of the greatest biologists ever in human history. He's been doing work for decades around biodiversity, human nature, and ecosystems. We're going to talk with him about how we can apply some of those principles to the work we're doing at the Kauffman Foundation.
The next big thing in biology, and particularly in the larger realm of evolutionary biology, is understanding the principles of ecosystems. We don't have a solid body of principles of ecosystem building or maintenance. There is lying before young scholars, scientists in particular, but with lots and lots of opportunity for input from the business world and from economic theorists, lots and lots, because they have a common interest, is the questions. How are ecosystems created? Now I'm taking us into the natural world, where let's have a bare island that's just risen up, like the ones off Iceland or the ones that appear periodically in the Pacific. A new island originates, a seamount. This rises above the level of the water. And now you have this fill up with living organisms. But they're not just a lot of plants and animals thrown in together. There are combinations of plants and animals that seem to do best colonizing the island and then remaining there in perpetuity, perhaps evolving species by species, changing to adapt exactly to the condition it finds on the island, but also being open to other species coming in that seem to, that fit. I don't mean that they're engage in a conscious will, but determining by the structure that they form who will be able to stay and succeed and who will go extinct. That's real ecosystems. and then returning to what's going to be the next big thing in biology, is we need to know what the principles are in how an ecosystem forms in the first place on our island, fills in. And then we need to know what causes it to evolve and what are the usual steps in the evolution of an ecosystem. What is happening to it? The third thing, though, I was about to mention was equilibration. Once you've got a rich ecosystem present, what equilibrates that? Who's got to go extinct? What species, not there yet, might help stabilize the whole thing? You want to have a rich ecosystem. I mean, let's put it this way. If you have a rich ecosystem, that's what can build up, then you're interested in knowing what will equilibrate it so that those species hold on to their portion of the niches that make up the ecosystem. And we don't know that yet. We have a few ideas, things like keystone species. These are species we know, and we can't see them very easily or know what they are. But when you pull them out, then the whole system declines quickly and may collapse completely. There are such species, but we don't know how to identify them yet. So ecosystems analysis in biology, ecosystem studies, if you wish, are going to be exploding in the future because so much valuable new information is going to be coming out of them. And I would say that those who are in the realm of ecosystem building of economics systems like to make the analogies, like to know what the principles are, would perhaps be able to contribute and will benefit a great deal.
Now, what do all these layers mean? Our world can't exist without all of these layers. Each layer affects the ones above and below it. So to understand the world, we have to see all the layers as a whole, and to see how each of them interacts with the others. That's an ecosystem. It's where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts because of how all the parts interlock together. We can't change anything in a lasting way without moving all the layers at once. Once you know what to look for, you can see ecosystems everywhere. For instance, you might love the cool artwork on your cup of latte, made here at this coffee shop here in Silicon Valley. But having that latte art depends entirely on a coffee shop being here to serve it to you. That's business. And that business depends on the plumbing, electricity working well, infrastructure. And the plumbing and electricity only work because of the laws and rules that ensure we're getting clean water and dependable energy. That's governance. And those laws and rules only exist because we have a government based on principles of freedom, democracy, and basic rights. That's our culture. And that cultural desire for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness runs deep in human nature, and it keeps popping up in so many ways throughout history. Think of the whole, how all those layers fit together like the gears of a giant, complex, magical clock. That's ecosystems. And when you finally grasp that simple but big idea, it's like an epiphany. You don't just know it, you can feel it. Because to understand ecosystems is to experience the world differently. Once you've gone through all these different aspects of the world, what's left?
So when I then think about affect and all these things impinging on us as being at the root of experience, then it boils down to chemicals. What's the chemical in you, and what's that chemical doing? Adrenaline, testosterone, estrogen. That is what your experience is made out of. And so the whole idea of experience for me then is this chemical world in which our chemistry changes through life. So we know these things affect our experience. The cycles we go through in terms of estrogen and testosterone, that the testosterone tends to maintain a constant, whereas the estrogen tends to fluctuate throughout the sort of like the ovulation period. So now we have male and female, but they're all having different chemicals, and they are part of what forms culture. In fact, the first time I saw the estrogen cycle, for me it was like an inductor. It, pulls. So when you put the two together, it's like a magnet going back and forth. And that, I like that dynamic. I know that's what nature is. So our experience, even when we now, so at the very basic level, it's chemistry. The rainforest is just like a crucible in which we're having all these chemical reactions. So that's experience for me.
Is it really possible, though, to be able to redesign, a world in a way that's different than one has ever experienced or even knew was possible? Right? Given that our upbringing shapes us so much and constrains our choices, and the world as we know it is just one set of choices in so many possibilities, how is it possible to expand one's experiences or work outside one's experiences to actually design a different kind of world?
Imagination. I think the idea that when we sleep at night, we imagine. It's like,
anything's possible.
Anything is possible. There were tribes that when they wake up in the morning, they sit around and say, "What do you dream about? What do you dream about? What do you dream about?" That's brainstorming. So for me, psychedelics is not different from the food we already take. For example, for myself, I notice that when I eat beans, it actually makes me my thinking sharper. But beans, is it a psychedelic? People will say no, but it's a food. Is it a drug? No, it's a very thin line between them. And I think with exploration of DNA and the genomics and it's chemistry. So what I hear you say is, if we don't want to do chemistry on ourselves, if we don't want to experiment with ourselves, what are the alternatives? And I would say none. Because it's imagination, it's entrepreneurship, it's risk-taking. When those kids that developed the first bomb did not think they were going to create a bomb. And we mix this and mix this. Your reassembly or recombination. So some of the experiments could be fatal. I do not dispute that. But I tend to err on the side of imagination and experimentation.
I think what you're saying is, to experiment with making the world better or different, we have to be willing to experiment with ourselves.
Yes, that's very important. Being willing to... So there's the external experiment, which we do as scientists. There's an internal experiment. Being able to confront your fears is an internal experiment. Being able to confront your own vulnerabilities is an internal experiment. Then it becomes very, very clear why innovation is a state of mind.
Once we dissolve the distinctions, what that does is it gives us a greater capacity to then inhabit the distinctions. So we don't want to dissolve them in order to exile them and stay in the, oneness. Right. We want to access the oneness in order to enliven the diversity in a more authentic way. Yeah. So when we move into the kind of beautiful work that you're doing and wanting to bring women into innovation, my sense is that we're dealing with two different polarities here, or two different conversations. One is about men and women. The other is about masculine and feminine. And then to couple that with what I've been talking about of clearing and opening the individual systems to really be aligned with their creative genius, then it doesn't matter what their skin bag is, it doesn't matter. But we're still finding our way to create the conditions where I don't just look at you and make all sorts of stereotypes and assumptions about who you are, but I'm an open container. I have good instincts whether you're safe or not initially, and let's be real, 95% of the people on the planet are safe, not 5%, 95. So then I can lean into, well, who are you? And what is being your nationality, your ancestry, your sexual orientation, your gender, how does that inform what you bring to the innovation table?
Yeah. Where, as you said, you go beyond the distinction, but you don't use it as a limiting factor.
Correct. So I think there's ways to do that cognitively, there's ways to do that relationally, emotionally, and there's ways to do that individually and somatically. I've devised a self-development process that's body-based, somatic-based, that does help make the distinctions and weave the integration.
Right.
So it offers a map, which is a cognitive frame, a relational frame, and then a personal frame as well. And I think complex and multi-dimensional experiences together are what create the conditions for that kind of complexity to actually come into a sense of coherence.
If you take systems and you add design, what do you get?
Well, let me say that while the systems engineering people can ignore design, the designer can't ignore systems, because whatever the product or service is, it will be developed in mind, intangible. It will be tested, it will be manufactured, it will be distributed, it maybe has to be serviced. And all of those stages demand systems thinking. So I, the designer, can't escape. You, the systems engineer, can escape design. We discovered that the very best predictor is the emotions we share. Has nothing to do with data, facts, figures, spreadsheets. The very best predictor is the emotions we show. If we show a lot of negative emotions, we fail. If you've got a crazy idea, I like that, that's really crazy. We can get along and we can explore, and our probability of breakthrough innovation goes very high.
Okay, Neeraj, how does one share the experience of an ecosystem with someone who has never been there? I know you've created ecosystems in Nigeria, in India, and even here in the Silicon Valley and in Kansas City. How do you share that experience with someone who has never been there?
The one thing which I think has really worked for us is to create contrast. I think an experience is meaningful when it is contrasted with something different. So one way of sharing an experience of an ecosystem is to give back-to-back experiences, one which is a rainforest, one a plantation, and let people sense contrast.
So now that we have seen the whole ecosystem, how all the layers interact together, what do we do with that insight? Once you see it, you can learn how to act. You act by making all the layers work together. That's called design. Design is about fitting parts together so they work right. And just like designers can make great products, like your phone has thousands of parts fitting together beautifully, you can design ecosystems by making all the layers fit together in the right way. You can't change the world without being conscious of how fashion, business, governance, infrastructure, culture, and nature all click together to make the world we see. They're the equivalent of the engineering components to design the ecosystem around you. How would you describe design thinking?
So I think for a long time, people had been told they were not creative. What design thinking has been able to do is to begin to help people reimagine themselves as being creative. So design thinking is really more of an attitude. It's interesting people call it thinking, but it's an attitude. It's a way of life. You become human again. Now, it does have elements of teamwork. So it helps us recreate the hunter-gatherer. Think of, if you look at the steps in design thinking, in the formalized steps, empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. Well, to do all those things, you need a variety of human skills. That design thinking is basically about how a hunter-gatherer tribe explores the unknown. We start from a place where I don't know how and I don't know why. There actually isn't any step.
So design thinking for you is a way to reimagine, again, the possibilities, because it's sort of like an antidote to the training that people have received their whole lives.
So design thinking is really an antidote to the individualization that we had come to value, which drove us. We made certain achievements, but we lost certain things. That word, when you think about design thinking, and I think empathy as the first step, why did we need to be taught empathy? Why?
It should be so natural. Right?
It should be. And so design thinking helps to reveal what was not there. That we had stopped, empathy was no longer of value to us. But we had gone with that individualization. We had fantastic atoms in society, and it wasn't doing us much good. It had gone too much. And I think now we're beginning to get a sense of what we can do together. It still takes, because we're resistant to change in any direction. Because the tribe that is all together, they will resist atomization. And those that have been atomized will resist the connection. So we have some ways to go in reestablishing those norms. However, I think the environment plays a role in who we become. And so the whole idea of the rainforest begins to tell us that, it's okay to work at the human-to-human level, but the environment also plays a role in shaping who we are. So I think that's a very, very key part of the chemistry.
What do we need to do to help people to now really taking action? What's the valley in between?
Well, the most important valley is the fact that 99% of what makes innovation or these ecosystems actually work and thrive is completely invisible to the naked eye. What we prefer to do, rather than going over and having a conversation or giving a talk or giving people a prescription for innovation, we'd much rather have them travel here and actually experience an ecosystem where we can point out everything. Because once we kind of highlight what we want them to see, and then allow them to experience that, then two things will happen. One is what they now think, which is the mindset, aligns with what they're feeling. We can call that the heart set or the gut set. And when those two begin agreeing with one another, then people begin nodding their head up and down going, I get it. And more importantly, they go, I believe it. And it's once that they have that belief system, now they can go back and take it and begin sharing it and inculcating it in the community there.
Is it possible, rather than having people come here, which is quite costly for a lot of people, can we create a demo of Silicon Valley, of this kind of culture, of these kind of serendipitous conversations? Can we take the demo to them?
I think you absolutely can. And it's not only can you actually physically take it to them, but these are the kinds of tools that people can actually be doing virtually, where they can actually be in one place and we can be in another. We can meet up in virtual or digital environments, create a scenario where we now begin having these conversations, and human beings will still biomimic each other in this. We'll try to see this. And when we see other people doing things and we kind of like what they're doing, we're going, how do I get me some of that? How do I then do that? And we then can begin emulating.
So drawing from the field of complexity, all systems require requisite diversity. And that policy that states that only women of a certain type of background should have children is highly problematic, as we know. It dilutes the gene pool, right, if you think about it, because we need all sorts of intelligence. It's not just intelligence in the form of a degree, for example. One of the things that we have found useful is to actually encourage people to have very different experiences with things, and to actually think about policy very differently. In the past, we used to build policy in a very stock way, right? There was a certain way to build policy. You build it for the majority, and then, for the people who are not captured by that policy, you have, for example, social welfare systems that capture them. One of the things that we found increasingly popular in governments and in companies as well is people are trending toward what we call asymmetrical policy. So understanding that for policy to genuinely be good for the masses, it's not about having one policy for everybody. That might seem like equality, but it creates massive inequity. So how do we actually have asymmetrical policy that actually results in more equity? So for example, in the military, the admission criteria for men and women are different. And that's not to say it's not fair, but it actually values their attributes in different ways.
One of the things you have really thought through about is this idea of innovation as a religion, and the idea that we need characters or people like a Messiah, an evangelist, a prophet. Can you speak a bit about that diffusion of innovation?
We see these things as movements that then get propagated, and they start with ideas, and the ideas become the viruses. But the human beings are the carriers of those viruses, and so they kind of have to share them. And when people who, as you call them, these messiahs, these messengers, have these are the entrepreneurs, these people with these crazy ideas, and as they begin sharing them with people, they're people who go, that's kind of interesting. I want to join your tribe. I want to join your movement. And they come, and they will then begin taking in these messages. But then these early apostles, what they do is they take that message and they begin communicating it with others. They enroll other people in this movement. But they do it not only with the voice of the original messenger, but in their own voice. They're able to tell their story about what these ideas actually mean to them. Because one of the most important aspects of any entrepreneur is the ability for storytelling. And the reason it's so important is because almost all of these people are talking about something that doesn't yet exist. It's something that exists outside of the present. And so in order to do that, we have to be able to see what that future reality looks like. But more importantly, we have to understand what our role is in that future. What role do we play? And then how do I emotionally get excited about taking that next step to kind of join that movement? And so when I tell that story about what it means to me and why I've joined the movement, that's a critical aspect rather than just why this one person is kind of starting this idea. And then it just starts like a movement and begins growing.
Sometimes people just repeat the same story and they try to up ante one another. However, in talking about having an apostle, an evangelist, and a number of these different roles, it's not the same story being repeated, but there's a trajectory to the story. Can you speak about those specific roles you had in mind?
Exactly. So there definitely is a trajectory, because as I said, they're meant for different audiences and different people. And so you've got the Messiah, and then you've got the apostles, the people close to the Messiah who then kind of carry these messages. But the apostles then talk to a series of disciples, people who kind of come to hear this message and begin carrying it forward. And then the disciples create evangelists, these people who get excited about this stuff. But the narrative gets tweaked slightly because different people have different resonance or different objectives with the story. So an example within a startup is that as you create these movements, you're trying to attract people to come work for you. You're also trying to attract investors who are going to put money and have faith in you that way. But you're also trying to attract talent and employees who are going to work with you, as well as the investors who will back you, as well as the stakeholders and customers who will buy your products and services. And so each one of those is a slightly different message. Now, you do have to worry about kind of the echo chamber where the cycles of narratives get rolled over. And that actually does happen. We buy into the super narrative of what's going. And that's why it can sometimes be detrimental, because if we truly buy into that without ever questioning it, then we become potentially numb or blind to the consequences that we're not considering on the other side. And that's also happened with successful startups.
So for someone that wants to be a designer of ecosystems, what does that mean then? It means they're approaching ecosystem design the same or different than, say, other types of design?
I think they have to approach it very, very different. So how do you create an ecosystem when you become part of the condition? What's the energy you bring to the ecosystem? What's the willingness to fight for the cause on behalf of others who may not even acknowledge you? So our current system kind of rewards us, the whole incentive structure rewards the certain kind of behavior. If you're now trying to build an ecosystem outside of that incentive structure, you must be ready to make the sacrifice. Now, understand that if we now decide to start making that incentive structure this other way, then we kind of just move the same system back. So there is an internal component that is very important in building innovation ecosystem.
That every individual has an effect on the whole system, and it starts with yourself.
It starts with yourself. That you have to understand, and that people will be emulating you. And so in fact, it's a new construct of leadership that requires for the innovation ecosystem. So innovation requires a different construct of the self and a willingness to almost do therapy on the self.
And then after, let's say someone has that, they've been able to, get a grip on themselves as much as a human being can. How do they then transmit back out and design the environmental conditions to make change in the bigger ecosystem?
Start building it. So in a former world, in the industrial world, we build things by command and control. We tell others to do it. And but once you see that in building an ecosystem, it starts from you, that's the only way it works. So it's a different form of leadership by example, leadership by encouragement, leadership by understanding. So that's why really first the awareness, then you have to seek to begin to understand the ecosystem, and you'll try and you feel, because none of us has the knowledge to build an ecosystem. So we're trying, and because the world is changing. So if I told you I had the knowledge to build an ecosystem like today, it's outdated tomorrow. So I have to be in community. I like that quote by Deborah Gordon, that colonies build colonies. In the industrial age, you could be the leader and you could instruct people to build that. For ecosystem, you need your team at least to build the ecosystem. You can't do it alone.
So what does this mean for your daily life? You can start seeing all of your daily actions in a bigger light. You don't just buy a cup of coffee. You're playing a part in and actually shaping all the other layers of the world. The impact of that little coffee ripples outwards like an invisible web. You are a shaper of the whole ecosystem around you. So if you want to start making the world better, you don't need to wait. You can start today. Every little action matters, even the small stuff. When someone needs your help, what you do makes a difference. Do you help them out or ignore them? Do you encourage them or say something negative? Do you brag about them to others or do you stay silent? Your response shapes the fabric of our society. And that's how the world is made better. Action by action, idea by idea, coffee cup by coffee cup.